And yeah, my background is both on the design side and the operations side. So I've been both a lead landscape designer at a firm here in Dallas, and then I also transitioned into being director of operations. So I've got extensive experience with running crews and being out in the field, as well as on the management side and doing some more of the design work. So I know kind of the challenges that exist on both of those, and how sometimes those two worlds don't always communicate super well. And I know on y'all's end, you end up with the management, or with the results of those management decisions. And sometimes landscapes are put in place that you're not familiar with. And that's kind of what we see happening a lot, is that we have these native landscapes that have been put in. They're beautiful. We put millions of dollars into them. And now is that next step where we're going to start really diving into how to maintain those and the operations that go behind that. Okay, so outcomes for today. We're going to go through three main things. Understanding Texas ecology. It's really vital to understand where we live and all the different things that come with that, because that's kind of the basis for management practices, right? Like, we can't do the same management practice here and then go to Minnesota and apply the same things. Like, it is very dependent on where you are. And so we need to have a better understanding of Texas ecology specific to North Texas and specifically Dallas. And then we're going to build our expertise in identifying diverse landscape types. Because, you know, if you've gone around Dallas enough, you know, a park in downtown Dallas utilizing native plants is going to be very different than if you go in the middle of the Great Trinity Forest, right? Those are two different landscapes. They're going to have two different maintenance methodologies. So we're going to go over how to identify those and then figure out which maintenance methodologies need to be applied to each landscape. And then leveraging that knowledge just to develop your best management practices and how to overcome certain challenges that are going to arise inevitably when you're working with a living space. That is one of the things that makes y'all very unique, is that the material you're working with is very much alive. So it's a lot of working with it. And we're going to talk about a little bit of moving from controlling it to collaborating with it and how to best do that. All right, so that is our outline. Other thing, if there's questions that are on topic as we go, please by all means just go ahead and ask them. I am going to have some sections at the end of each one where y'all can ask questions, but if you've got something, just feel free to raise your hand and ask them as we go. Okay, so we're going to start with Texas ecology and the urban environment. First and foremost, some definitions. We're going to go through a lot of terminology today. Some of this terminology you may be familiar with, but it is important to be able to understand it to the point that you can also communicate it to your crews. Because one of the reasons that y'all were selected here today was so that y'all can actually gain this knowledge and then be able to train your own crews with the things that we're learning here today. So we're going to go over that. Ecology. What is ecology? What does that even mean? And it's about the relationships between living organisms. So that in many ways means all the natural living organisms, such as like insects and the microbiome of the soil and the trees and the plants and all different animals. You know, how all those things interact with each other. But then we get to urban ecology. Where we've created an entirely different ecological system here, right? Like, we have cities now, we have concrete, we have cars, we have buildings, we have all the different things that come with modern living. So we've kind of created this separate category of how do these two things interact. And that is where we get urban ecology. And then biodiversity. This is another really important thing that we're going to be talking about today. It is probably the biggest theme that we really need to be focusing on just in our entire profession, is how to increase biodiversity. And what that is essentially the amount of organisms that exist within a space. So right now, right here, there's one. It's humans. We're the only thing in here right now. We're the only living things in here. But if we go out to this park, suddenly we're a part of a much bigger landscape, and there's a lot of different living things in that landscape. And the goal with biodiversity is to create more. So not just more of one species, but more species total. So whether that's more plant species, whether that's more insect species, landscapes are healthier the more things that are there. And that's kind of what biodiversity gets down to in its simplest form, is that the more of it that is there, the healthier the landscape is going to be, because it is going to kind of take care of itself. And a lot of the issues that arise are because we have a lack of biodiversity. We have a lack of things that are taking care of each other, then suddenly we have to do a lot more work. So we're going to focus on increasing biodiversity. Okay, Texas ecoregions. A lot of this is fancy terminology for stuff we already know. Think about how, if you go to East Texas, right? Has anybody been to East Texas? Yes. Okay. What's the landscape like in East Texas? Trees, right? We've got forests, we've got pine trees, we've got red dirt. You know, there's a lot of things there that if you just come a little bit further west, suddenly that all disappears. And then, if you go over to West Texas, suddenly it looks like Mars. There's mountains, there's red dirt, there's cactus, you know, it's a totally different landscape. And then we've got a coastal region, you know, we've got beaches over here. So what this is saying is that nature pays no attention whatsoever to the lines that humans have created in creating states and countries, but they do have their own lines that they've created. So ecosystems have their own natural lines that they've created that's actually based on the geology and then based on the soil, and then that builds up to the different plant communities, insect communities, etc., right? And so in Texas, we actually have the most diverse state of any state, arguably with California, of ecoregions. So most states are only going to have 1 to maybe 3 different ecoregions. Texas, we have at least 10. Scientists kind of argue about it, but generally speaking, we have about 10. And the one that we live in is right here. It's this green one, or it's on this map. It's this pink one. Is the Blackland Prairie. And it is vital that we understand how the Blackland Prairie works because all of our parks lie within the Blackland Prairie and what was the Blackland Prairie, right? So interesting things about Blackland Prairie. Oh, and other quick note on this. It is important to understand when we're talking about native landscapes, what does native mean? Does native mean just Blackland Prairie? Or does native, if we're talking about a Texas native landscape, does that encompass all of them? Does that talk about the Trans-Pecos region over here? You know, these are important things to understand when we're talking about native landscapes. There's not necessarily one right answer, so it's just important to have an idea of what that all means and encompasses. Because as you talk to different people, they might mean slightly different things. So having that knowledge ahead of time helps you narrow down what you need to accomplish and what information is being communicated. So, Blackland Prairie. A few things about the Blackland Prairie. Some of this you already know. Soils. If any of y'all have tried to stick a shovel in the ground, you are very familiar with the type of soil that exists in the Blackland Prairie. It is known as black gumbo to many. If you try to use a regular shovel, you will hate your life. It is a hard soil, but it's actually very nutrient dense. And it is full of vertisols, which is just a fancy word for something we already see, which is the shrinking and swelling of the soil. So, you know, if it hasn't rained in a while, you see those big old cracks that come up in the soil, and it kind of looks like a tortoiseshell pattern on the ground, where all these different cracks have formed in the dirt. And then if we get one of those heavy rains, that soil swells up and those cracks disappear. Oftentimes you'll see this in lawns. Sometimes if you have a hard time getting grass to grow, you'll see those cracks start forming. Those are caused by vertisols. So, I mean, that is actually not a bad thing. I know it is very frustrating if you're trying to get grass to grow there, but it is actually a natural occurrence in the Blackland Prairie, and it does serve a very important purpose, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then the vegetation that is native to the Blackland Prairie is very much akin to this. This is what this looks like. This is actually a picture from some true Blackland Prairie that we don't see a lot of here in Dallas. It's a tall grass prairie. So think about lots of flowing grasses, lots of wildflowers. That's kind of the idea of what Blackland Prairie was. There are 4, we call it the Big 4. Those are our primary grasses that made up most of the Blackland Prairie. It's big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. And then there's thousands of different forb species. Forbs are just kind of like wildflowers. And there's thousands of species, and it's a very, very, very diverse ecoregion that we have here. Topography, as we know, it's level, kind of rolling a little bit. And then climate, we're all pretty familiar with. Important to note here, though, we have less than 1% of it left. Because those soils were so rich that when settlers came here, they're like, you know what grows great here? Crops. Crops were great here. And so all that prairie got converted into crop farmland. And then as that soil slowly got depleted, because most of the farming techniques were not necessarily the most honoring of the soil, that got converted into So then that was being used for cows and whatnot. And then after that, we have what we have today, which is it got developed. It makes housing developments and buildings, and we built cities there. So that's mostly where it is today. And actually now we have less than 0.01% of the Blackland Prairie left. That is why, as you drive through the city, you don't see it. That's why when we talk about Blackland Prairie, most people are going to have absolutely no idea what we're talking about, because they're not seeing it anywhere. There are very few little pockets left. This is a photo from one of them that is out east, called Climber Meadow, that is very, very heavily protected. So it's important to know that this is what was here, because as we're building management practices for the land, a lot of the elements of this are still very present, right? And as we're talking about different plants that are going to do well there, we kind of need to know how the Blackland Prairie worked. Even though it is very different now, it is good to have a base knowledge of how this works so that we can build those best management practices for putting in the plants that we know are going to work. So these are just some fun creatures. This is what Blackland Prairie is made out of. Every single one of these native to the Blackland Prairie. So again, a lot of stuff that we are not necessarily seeing every day. But there are different spots throughout Dallas that you can actually go see any of these. So it is an incredibly diverse ecoregion. We have a lot of different things that call Blackland Prairie home, and a lot of them are still here. And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is, as park managers, it is so important, and we're very focused on making sure that we have areas for humans to recreate in, right? That is oftentimes that top purpose, and making sure that we're accomplishing that. And today we're going to be kind of adding to that and saying, okay, in addition to that, these are also spaces that many other residents, non-human residents, call home. They're living here. So how do we take care of these spaces and match that, where we can say, yes, this is areas for humans to recreate, it is also areas where other residents are living, and how do we marry those two? But yeah, we also have the urban environment. So Blackland Prairie plus urban environment, we have an entirely new ecosystem now. And it's not present on that map, right? Because we have the urban environment, we've created something called urban ecology. And that, there's so many elements of that. We're not going to get into all of them. We're going to focus on 4, and that is development, drainage, urban heat island effect, and then just kind of general human activity, both positive and negative, and how those factors play into our park management, especially with how they interact with native landscapes. So, development. We've got a couple different things. Obviously, where we are now is something more like this. And so we've got parks within this environment, but then we also have parks within environments more like this, more residential areas that have new builds. And those are going to require different management practices. Even though they're both in the same city, they're both sitting on that Blackland Prairie soil, they are going to require different management practices because the surrounding development is so widely different, right? Here we have a residential area that likely isn't going to have a lot of shade. It's going to be more amicable to those grasses growing where we have full sun. All of that is going to work really well, where original Blackland Prairie plants might work really well in a park like over here. But then you get over here and say we were going to make this area into a park. Suddenly we have these huge tall buildings that are going to shade out the park for half the day, but it's also, when it is going to be sunny, it's going to be twice as hot because it's going to have a reflection of all this glass on it. And so we've got totally different elements affecting what would be this green space. So that's where that other map of Texas comes into play, where you can say, okay, if we've got a really tall building and something that can handle a lot of heat, and Blackland Prairie might not be our answer, but then we think, what could work? That area in West Texas. This could be a mountain. This could absorb the heat that is caused by all the sun that is reflecting off of that glass. And those plants that do well in West Texas suddenly are probably going to do really well in this type of environment. So it's really important to consider the surrounding development of your parks. If you're in a residential area, it's going to be wildly different than if you're in a downtown area. All right, drainage. Oh boy. Okay, so there's a lot going on with drainage, right? As we were just experiencing yesterday, we get torrential downpours often, and that can create some challenges in a city environment, especially when we have so much impervious surfaces. We're a city that has a lot of concrete, right? We've got a ton of concrete, that water's got to go somewhere, and it is going to go to the nearest green space that it can if it does not go into a storm drain first. So that's where parks come into play. And then oftentimes our parks are covered in grass, which is actually considered a semi-impervious surface. Grass does not absorb that much water. And the reason being is because this is turf grass. You see how the root system, how deep that root system is? Maybe what, 3 inches? Max if you're Bermuda grass, maybe 6 inches? You're not getting a lot of depth there. Versus, you've got these guys, these are all native plants and grasses, and look at those root systems. I know, sorry, it's hard to see down here, but on there, these roots, these can go like 10 feet deep. So if you think about that black gumbo, right, that really hard soil, and then you've got some plants that are breaking through that soil, creating channels, that creates somewhere for that water to go. So instead of getting runoff off the top surface or letting it just kind of evaporate after it's sat there for long enough, we've got an ability for this to actually replenish our water table, which right now, most of the surface out here, it's not gonna do that. But when you have native plants, they're creating channels all the way through that soil, that's gonna be able to replenish the water table, and that is a huge, huge, huge asset when it comes to stormwater runoff and drainage. So massive benefit here in the world of drainage. It also helps with compaction. As you know, even if you're building a park, but if you're building anything, you've got all this massive equipment going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, all across the soil. What's happening to that soil is getting compacted, compacted, compacted. And then you try to grow grass on top of it. And like, oh my gosh, right? Like we all know that's not gonna work. And so we have to get tillers out, and it just becomes a huge effort in order to actually be able to grow anything there. So with the compaction, again, if you've got these root systems that are super duper strong, they're able to break through all that compaction, break through that already hard soil, and be able to thrive in that type of dirt. So this is such an important picture. I just want us all to remember when we're talking about native plants, the stuff we're not seeing has a massive benefit. All right. Oh, other quick note on that, yeah, is erosion. I didn't even mention that. Yeah, we don't have a ton of erosion issues here because we are fairly flat. We have a little bit, but there are certain areas of parks where I'm sure you've experienced this. I'm going to say specifically under live oak trees, under a lot of shade trees. We get areas where suddenly you can't grow grass because there's not enough sun, and then you get these bare dirt spots. All that dirt starts to run off, and then you end up with it in your sidewalk, and you have to end up cleaning that up every week, right? So this is another area that native plants come in handy because we've got native plants that grow sun, shade, anywhere in between, and they are accustomed to growing. There are plants accustomed to growing under shade trees. So being able to utilize that and have that knowledge, that can also help with erosion big time. Because again, all these root systems keeping all of that dirt in place, as opposed to this little guy right here. All right. Urban heat island effect. I'm not sure how familiar we are with this, but the City of Dallas actually conducted a massive study for it took them 2 or 3 years to study how hot the city is, essentially. And so they are basically taking different surface temperatures. So saying, okay, we're going to take the surface temperature on a piece of concrete, and we're going to move 10 feet away, take the surface temperature on sod, on grass, and then we're going to go over here, and they did these plots all over the city, and this has been the result. So you can see which areas of the city, well, ignore that, that's Highland Park, but everything else, you can see where certain areas are hotter than others. So you get really hot little cores right here, that right there. Does anybody know what that is? It's Great Trinity Forest. That guy right there is Great Trinity Forest. So we've got some greener areas that are going to be less hot versus your areas that have high concentration of buildings like downtown, where it's going to be more hot, right? And this is another area where parks may play a massive, massive, massive role because it helps bring that down. The problem of why cities are so hot is because they heat up all day in the sun, right? And if you're out in the country, it cools down at night, everything cools down, and then we just start over, right? So it kind of fluctuates a little bit more. When you're in the city, all that concrete, all that glass, all those buildings, they just hang on to that heat overnight. That's why you go outside at 3 a.m. and it's still freaking hot. still so hot. And then you start the next day and you're already starting and it's warm. You know, it just never has that opportunity to cool back down. So that's essentially what the urban heat island effect is, in short. But parks work to combat that because green spaces are so much cooler. Which again, we all know this, right? Walking under a tree is way cooler than if you're outside. So parks play a massive role in combating urban heat island effect. The more parks that we have, the better. And also, surprisingly, prairies and like those tall grasses, that absorbs a lot more heat than turf grass. So sod, it's not going to actually make it that much cooler, but if you have a prairie, it drops that temperature down way lower. All right, human activity. We're all familiar with this. You know, we've got the full gamut, right? We've got great human activity. We've got kids playing soccer. We have family barbecues. We have concerts, all the fun things that our parks are used for and that we create spaces for in our parks. And then we have the aftermath of a lot of those things, or whatever nefarious activity people are up to. And then we also have more like, necessary neutral things. We have areas where it's like, yeah, we need electricity. It's got to run somewhere. But all of these are disturbances, right? There are going to be disturbances to the landscape. And so it's really important to just see, to recognize what all of those are and to be able to factor those in when we're talking about best management practices and just being aware of the reality of whatever human activity is going to play a role in those parks specifically. Here in downtown, you're going to have a totally different crowd, totally different issues maybe that's going to be than something that's maybe in North Dallas, right? Those are going to be two different ball games. So just being aware of what human activities exist in your parks and how it's going to affect them, that's also going to be key to building those practices. All right, benefits, going native. There's a lot of them. So we're just going to roll through. Habitat creation. What I said earlier about biodiversity and making sure that we build spaces that are friendly to more than just humans, that is incredibly important. So supporting that biodiversity, making homes for all of them to live in. Aesthetic value, honestly, just simply, this is really pretty, right? Native landscapes can just be really pretty, and so that has value just in that alone. It also, they improve air quality, the stormwater management that we talked about. Reduced operational costs, we're going to get there as well. We're going to be talking a lot about operations today. Conserving water. These guys barely need any water. They can live on rainwater, so we like that. Mitigating that urban heat island effect like we talked about. Protecting the soil from that erosion. And also, all of those native plants give nutrients back into the soil in a way that sod just doesn't. And then it has higher climate resilience. So when we got like that freeze, was that like 2020, whatever that was, we had a lot of plant death, but all the natives, they're fine. Those plants did just fine. So got to think about that too. When we're talking about low maintenance, if we want low maintenance is native. And then just creating that natural historic value and honoring the heritage of what this land was, right? There's value in that. There's a lot of value in being able to go somewhere and you see that landscape and you know exactly where you are, right? If you ever go to like Arizona, you know you're in Arizona. Just look at the landscape. Versus when you come here, sometimes it kind of starts looking like any other city. And so if you add those native plants in, it creates that cultural value of a city. And just knowing where you are and knowing that place, and then again, just the benefits of honoring what this land has been. So, fun examples of how cities have done this. My personal favorite, beavers. So, just little fun fact on this. Prague, so city in Czech Republic, it's in Central Europe. They were converting an area to a park. There's an old military base, and they're like, you know what, we want to make this a park. But gosh, this is going to cost us millions of dollars. There's so many drainage issues. These creeks have been destroyed. We're going to have engineers come in. We're going to have designers come in. We're going to have all this stuff. So humans are doing what humans do and working through all that red tape of figuring out budgets and contracts and yada, yada, yada. And that's taking years. And in the meantime, this guy came on in with his family. And he ended up actually building dams that reconstructed the entire waterway of this area, fixed all the drainage issues in the year and a half that the humans were arguing about this, and saved the city about 1.2 million euros, which is almost $2 million. So that's a great example. And now they continue this, and they actually work with the beavers, and they have them in downtown Prague, which is just wild. I've been there, I've seen this. And I actually went to Verde Protected Landscape Area to go check it out because I thought it was cool. So yeah, that's like fun fact. And then the Highlines, another really fun example of how a really big city. This is in New York City. It's in Manhattan. So not a lot of, you don't think about a lot of green space maybe outside of Central Park. But they had an old rail line, and so it was not being used anymore. And they instead decided to convert that into a park and utilize native plants throughout the entire thing. So now it's a really cool trail that's got native plants on either side. So just there's a lot of fun ways that you can work with native ecology that creates value into your city, right? Like it just kind of creates these really cool areas of the city, and then it works really well, and humans enjoy it, and it ends up actually bringing money into the city because of those things. So opportunities for Dallas, massive, right? We're a huge city, both in land and in people. We have 23,000 acres of land within our park system. Y'all know this. We've got like over 400 parks. They're huge. We have a lot of really big parks. And it comprises about 11% of total land. A lot of cities are getting up to 15, but because we have such huge parks, we actually have a lot more acreage than most other cities do. So thinking about that, we are starting to transition more spaces into native landscapes. That is going to continue, right? And that's a good thing. We want that because there's a lot of cost savings with that. There's a lot of operational savings with that. And just even, again, thinking about what it would look like if you looked out onto a park and there's a section that looked more like this, you know, had more flowers, had more grasses, had more nature, and you weren't having to mow it every week or two, right? Especially on a slope in the middle of this. Like, you don't want to mow that. So being able to recognize which parts of our parks would be beneficial to convert over to native landscaping because maybe they're not being used as lawn space. Keep the lawns where the lawns are being used, and then the surrounding areas, rethinking those as potential areas where we can convert that back to these native landscapes. So just think about what that would look like. 25% of the sod is converted, 50% of that sod is converted. Being able to do like a, an analysis of how much of the sod is actually being used for kids playing soccer, for, family barbecues, for outdoor concerts, and which areas are sod just out of convenience. Because at that point, we're just piling on operational costs of mowing it and all these other things when you could convert that back to native and add more value and you have less work. So we're going to dive into that. Quick numbers on maintenance costs of native versus conventional. And then installation costs of each one. There's a lot of data on that we can dive into later. Also, reduced water usage. That is a huge piece. We're not exactly abundant in water in the city, and we have a lot of people moving here. So just thinking about ways that we can conserve more water, and plants don't need nearly as much. And then just a quick biodiversity case study. This is a tiny area I did relative to a park, right? This was in the middle of a neighborhood. So 0.1 acre, so very small area. But the amount of plant specimens I had was over 2,000, just near 3,000. I had 120 different species. So talking about biodiversity, that's the goal for creating it. Even a small area can house so many different species. And that space is incredible. It's beautiful and also just has a ton of ecological value. So imagine what we could do with 23,000 acres of park when this is just 0.1. Okay, and then role of park managers. So yeah, y'all are all in the thick of this. This is right in the middle of everything for you. And a lot of the training that's been done is on conventional landscape. So at this point, I'm assuming all of y'all are pretty much experts in conventional landscape methods. This is what you do for a living. And I think that's great. It's very needed because we're still going to have those conventional landscapes in our park system. But now we're also saying, hey, we're going to, in addition to that, have native landscapes. So now your job starts to become determining which methods are going to be needed for which areas. And you're kind of at this point where you're doing this hybrid ecology because it's not going to be a park that's all native or all conventional. You're going to have a mix of both. And you're going to be able to you're going to need to be able to see which area is native, which area is conventional, and which one is going to need different management practices. So that's what we're really aiming to get y'all towards. Because there's just a huge intersection there. The other thing is being able to consider all the different residents in our management practices, not just humans. Okay, there's a lot of different things that call this place home, and a big part of our jobs is to actually be able to take care of all of them. You know, we focus on humans a lot. We like to make ourselves center of attention, but there is actually a lot of other different residents that live in these areas. Being able to identify those areas of improvement. Like what we were saying earlier, you've got this big slope. Is the sod out of convenience, or is the sod actually being used for its purpose? And then just being those community leaders and having that initiative to be able to say, like, hey, we can convert this area, it's this many acres, and if we convert this to native, this is the cost savings on that. And y'all are also the face that's going to interact with community a lot. And community has a huge push right now towards more natives. They want butterfly gardens, they want native gardens, they want all these things. So just y'all's role in that is also vital and very important. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, which is diverse landscapes and landscape methodologies. This is a picture of the park that we're actually going to go check out today. It's Carpenter Park. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful example of how to put native plants into a downtown environment. And all those grasses that we talked about, they look stunning right now in that park, so I'm excited for us to go there this afternoon. Okay, get ready. We're going through a lot of terminology, or at least like 10 important ones. Native. Okay, native plant basically means that it naturally occurred here. My definition of many, is that pretty much before settlers got here from Europe, these were the plants that were growing here. That's the easiest way to think about it. It's just whatever was here back when all native indigenous people were here, the plants that grew there, those are native plants. We brought in a lot, and ever since things have started to globalize, you know, we bring in all these different species, but natives are kind of the OGs. That's who was here before. That's important because they co-evolved with the landscape in that Blackland Prairie, so they are still going to perform the best. Okay, adapted plants. Also fine. I don't mind a good adapted plant. Those are from other parts of the world, but they line up really well, and they do well here. You know, they do well, but they don't have negative effects on the native plants. They play nicely, right? They come in, they do their thing, they don't get in the way of native plants, and everybody's happy. Invasive plants, on the other hand, we hate them. We do not like these guys. They are from other parts of the world, and they come destroy native landscapes. They're so abundant, they do so well, and they have no natural predators that they just take over everything. And they create what we call monocultures, which is the opposite of biodiversity. Monoculture is when there's just one of a lot of things, one thing in a lot of different area, and it just destroys biodiversity and destroys native plants. Does anybody know our most common ones that we have here that we hate?
Privet and Sunburn.
Yep. This is privet. It's my personal nemesis. But yeah, basically they just hoard all the resources, all the light, and they don't play nicely. They take over. Okay, and then aggressive plants, because a lot of times these two get confused. Some people call things invasive that are not invasive. They are just aggressive. And that just means something that spreads a lot. You know, you plant one, and then you come back a couple months later, and it's like 5 times as big. So those are aggressive plants. And those, I will say, all invasive plants are aggressive. Not all aggressive plants are invasive. Okay? So aggressive plants just mean that they spread rapidly. And there are situations where we actually want this. We like this. Can anybody think of an example of when we want a plant to spread really quickly?
Ground cover.
Ground cover, yes. Got a big old dirt patch, we want stuff covered, right? We want that covered as soon as possible, especially if it's on a slope. So that is where aggressive plants come in handy. We like that. I would say a good example of that is inland sea oats. It is a grass here that's native to Texas, and it spreads like crazy. I would not recommend putting it in your home garden, but it does really well if you're trying to stabilize soil in certain areas, and it adapts really well to a lot of different conditions. So just be aware, sometimes people call things invasive. Even people in the industry will call things invasive, but what they mean is that it is aggressive. So just know that those are two different things. All right, and then all this other terminology that we get into that we hear left and right, pollinator gardens, butterfly gardens. What is that? A lot of times they're just like flowers, I guess, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So a pollinator garden, a butterfly is a pollinator, and these gardens are specifically designed to support pollinators, so you have to have plants that produce pollen. Like a rose garden is not a pollinator garden. Those things do not have any pollen. They offer no ecological benefit. They are pretty, but they do not offer any ecological benefit. So a pollinator garden is going to be filled with flowers and grasses actually that support them. More specifically, a butterfly garden is a garden that is going to take care of all the different phases of a butterfly's life cycle. So it's going to have the specific plants that those caterpillars eat. It's going to have flowers that the butterflies can feed on. Oftentimes they'll also have little puddling things so that they get water in a way that they like. But butterflies are notoriously picky about what plants their caterpillars will eat. So just making sure that we have the right ones. The classic example here is milkweed and monarch butterflies, which we all have probably heard about. But this is a milkweed, one of the varieties of milkweed, and that's Asclepias viridis. And that is one of the ones that monarch butterflies absolutely need to have because that's one of the only ones that their caterpillars will eat. So if we want to continue having monarchs, we've got to have milkweed. Xeriscaping, low water landscaping. Xeriscaping, I talk to a lot of people and they're like, I hate xeriscaping. And I'm like, interesting. You like watering? It's like, that's odd. But because a lot of people, when they think xeriscaping, they think of a desert. They're only thinking of rocks and cactus and agave. And that is not what xeriscaping is, but that is a common misconception that you will run into. So if you use the word xeriscaping, just know that a lot of people in the public, they're picturing a desert. When in reality, you can have some really beautiful xeriscaped properties. It's the same thing with low water landscaping. Honestly, I've stopped using this word because so many people do not know what that is, and I just use low water. Everybody understands that one, it's low water. But just know, those are the same thing. Wildflower no-mow areas. Again, I think we're all pretty familiar with these. We have quite a few of them in Dallas. Wildflowers is not a technical term. It's just, we all know what they are when we see them. Those more technical term is going to be native forbs. But typically it's going to consist of both forbs and grasses. And then sustainable landscaping. That's kind of the blanket term that's going to apply to a lot of this. It's going to have a lot of different elements to that. I say I practice in sustainable landscaping. But that's going to apply to water, that's going to apply to ecological benefit, that's going to also apply to human benefit. Like, is it benefiting the people that are also interacting with these landscapes? So, it's just being conscious of the world around you is basically what that one is. Okay, last set. Conventional versus native. A lot of us kind of know this. If we look out, we can tell what's a native landscape and what is a conventional landscape. A lot of it, if you're just familiar enough, you can kind of see, like, this is what a lot of our parks look like, right? This conventional landscape. It's grass, it's shade trees, it's hedges, sometimes a lot of annual color if you're in areas that are a little bit more manicured. And so there's definitely a place for conventional landscaping, especially in cities. We need conventional landscaping because, again, kids need somewhere to play soccer, and that's going to be a lawn. But it does have different priorities. So typically manicured lawns, trimmed hedges. They don't typically utilize a lot of native plants. And it's a very different mindset. Right? When we're talking about conventional landscape, it is a very different mindset. There's a lot of, I want this to look controlled, manicured, pristine, kind of perfect, right? Like that is more the mindset of a conventional landscape versus a native landscape has a totally different mindset and a totally different set of values, which a lot you'll notice we're talking about today. The value system is on, how many different species does this area support? And that's not always what everybody is valuing. So it's just a way of practicing and designing gardens that are indigenous to a specific region, and they've evolved there for forever. So get an idea. I think everybody kind of knows if you're looking at one space versus another, you can usually tell which one's which. Okay, this part is important because this is what we're going to be basing a lot of our management practices on, is this scale from one end to the other. So this is all for native landscaping. I'm going to say conventional landscaping over here. Like that's totally different. But just for native landscaping, We have more manicured areas. This is Carpenter Park. This is where we're going to be this afternoon. It is a native landscape. It utilizes all native plants. Well, in the garden areas, it's going to utilize all native plants. But you'll notice it's quite manicured. Like, it looks pretty manicured. It looks very well maintained. And it's going to resemble more conventional landscapes in a lot of ways. But then we start moving down the scale. If anybody's ever been to the Bush Library, they also utilize a lot of native plants. But it starts looking a little wilder. A lot of things allow you to seed out. It's less controlled. And then you start moving even further down the scale. This is Tandy Hills. This is in Fort Worth. And this starts getting even more wild. So less controlled. It is still managed. I want to make that clear that these areas are still managed, but they are a little more hands-off. So these areas really take care of themselves. And then on the far end of the scale here, this is Climber Meadow. That is that meadow I was talking about that is still kind of that OG Blackland Prairie. It is not really open to the public. There are some opportunities to go there if you ever want to go see it. It is very pretty. I highly recommend it. The Nature Conservancy manages this property. But that is where nature is allowed to nature. So this is kind of the scale that I want us to get used to, because all of these are native landscapes, but all of them have very different management practices. So, identifying your landscape. It is really important for us to figure out where on the scale a landscape is. Is it more designed and manicured, or is this more on the wild and managed side? Because that is what is going to determine how you're going to take care of it. If you are trying to, well, if you're here, for example, Climber Meadow, they burn it, because that's actually one of the best management practices for a prairie. Prairies love to be burned, because that's what happened naturally for thousands of years, is that lightning would strike, it would set a fire, it would burn it, and that is how they co-evolved, and that was actually fantastic for them. But of course, we're not going to go to Carpenter Park and burn Carpenter Park. That'd be ridiculous. Of course not. That's not what we do there. So there's a lot of different management practices that are going to apply depending on where your landscape falls on the scale. So one of the things that, if you walk away today, is getting used to identifying where a landscape is. So when you walk up to it, you can think, okay, this one's about 2, this one's maybe more of a 4. It's not an exact science, but just have an idea of where on the scale your landscapes are going to fall, because that is how you're going to determine which practices you're going to employ there. So, indicators. How can you tell? How do we tell? Because if you look at these 2 pictures, those are both native landscapes, but those are 2 very different places, right? This is actually in Canada, but this is all utilizing native plants, but that looks wildly different than this, which is on the side of a road. And again, we're going to be using different methods to take care of each one. So we're going to look at the site and the history of the spot, the design, and then the different plant material. That's going to be what kind of gives us those indicators of where on the scale a landscape is going to fall. Okay, site assessment. Kind of similar with what we're talking about with development. You got to look at what's around this place. Some of this seems a little obvious, but just making sure to make note of it. Because this, for example, is a native garden. This is on a rooftop in Chicago. That's very different than a state park, right? Those are totally different landscapes. And so figuring out the location. No, this one is actually in Texas. This one is, yeah, but this one is in Chicago. So this was utilizing native plants in Chicago. This one is in Texas.
Central Park?
I don't remember. I'd have to look. Sorry. But looking at the location, that's going to be your first indicator. Am I in the middle of downtown, or am I on the country? And in y'all's case, for the city, Dallas is so huge, we actually have a lot of space. We have areas that are looking a little rural, right? Like, there are areas kind of more on those outskirts of southern Dallas that are quite rural. We still have gigantic forest here. We have prairies that are, butt up to that forest. And so they're going to look a little bit more like this versus something more urban, which is what we're going to be talking about and looking at today. But just note where your location is in the surrounding environment. I would also note that history, I think, is really important because there are some areas where you walk up and you're like, has this just been like this? And nobody's ever done anything? Or there's other areas where, like, for example, there's parks where you had like master naturalist groups or whatever come in and put their native gardens. And so there's a history there. There was a group that put this in. And so you want to be able to know that, so because that's going to kind of determine how you take care of it. And also the size is a really big deal. Management practices are going to differ depending on the size of your landscape. Carpenter Park, for example, where we're going to go today, it's fairly small. We've got fairly small garden areas. Versus if you go to White Rock Lake, you know, you're going to have these huge prairie areas that's going to require different maintenance. So the design as well is going to be another indicator. Was this space designed by somebody, or does this space occur naturally? If you can tell, these two gardens, they both look pretty natural, right? But one of these is designed. Can y'all tell the difference between those two? We've got this one, where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's designed. A human designed this garden, 100%. They utilize native plants. We love that. But this one, very much designed. The parks in downtown Dallas, very much designed. And landscape architects spent a lot of time designing those gardens. This, not designed. That was seeded. So that was somebody went out there, wildflower seed, and this is the result. So that's going to also give us an indicator of where on that scale, because more designed spaces are going to be closer to that 1, less designed spaces are going to be closer to that 5. Deep plant material. Okay, y'all, there's a lot of native plants in Texas. There's a ton. We've got like, I think over 10,000. None of us know all of them. So the expectation is definitely not know all native plants. You're not going to. But knowing some core ones is really important because you'll also be able to get used to which types of plants are going to be more common in which types of landscapes. In designed landscapes, ones that are more on that 1 scale, we're going to have plants that are more common in the industry, right? The ones that you can go to a nursery and get. So that's going to be like your red yucca. Oh, sorry. Well, now I think it's more. Yeah, red yucca, Texas sage, Mexican feathergrass, desert willow, pink muley. Those are ones that are more common. You'll be able to go to a nursery and get them. They're great. Most of these are native to West. Those 4 are West Texas. This guy is coastal Texas. That is going to be more indicative of that 1 scale. Okay, stuff that is more commonly available in the trade is going to be more designed, more manicured. Versus these guys, which you're not going to see in the nursery. You're going to have, they're only really going to be grown from seed. So you're going to be spreading wildflower seed. This is the type of stuff you're going to see. So getting somewhat familiar with what those 2 things are is going to be able to help you figure out where on that scale this garden lies. And we're going to go over later this afternoon a plant ID app so that you do not have to memorize all this stuff. It's extremely helpful. But if you're starting to see plants that you haven't really seen before in other gardens, there's a good chance that those plants were put in there through seed and that it's going to be more on that 5 end of the scale. Does that kind of make sense? The scale thing makes sense? Okay. So we are going to go to maintenance methodology. So we're going to get a little bit more into the operational side of things now. So conventional. There's way different maintenance methods that you'd use on a conventional landscape than you'd use on a native landscape. And that's again kind of going back to what those values and priorities are. So the priorities, we're going to work. Okay. The priorities for a conventional landscape typically are going to be that clean appearance, the uniformity, lawns, and we like standardization. And as a manager, I can just say I also like being able to standardize things. It is really nice to be able to know, like, this day and this month, every year, we're going to do this thing. Because it makes your job a lot easier to be able to standardize that annual maintenance. I'm just going to let y'all know now, that's a lot less relevant with native landscaping. There's a lot more going, reading it, and figuring out what maintenance it needs. But that is one of the benefits of conventional is that it can be very standardized. The material that is used, typically we're looking at sod and shade trees, and then depending on where you're at, you might also have hedges, and if you're in a more manicured area, you're also going to have a lot of annual color. So that's the stuff that gets changed out 3-4 times a year. The operations that go along with conventional. There's a lot more. That's kind of the downside is you've got regular mowing, blowing, trimming, hedging, seasonal color change out, annual mulching, consistent irrigation, herbicide, pesticide, shaping, trimming trees. There's a lot that goes into taking care of conventional landscapes. So on the operational side, that kind of skyrockets because in order to keep that clean, crisp appearance, you have to have a lot of different maintenance that goes with that. So the pros of this is that honestly, that's what's widely taught and understood. Most people in the industry, when they have experience in landscaping, they have experience in conventional landscaping. You know, that's where everybody is trained in. Everybody in this room has been trained in conventional landscaping methods. So it's kind of, you have that operational predictability. But the cons here, not a lot of ecological value. You know, we're not helping the environment a ton with just having a facade. It does create monocultures, which we're not huge fans of. And then it's got the higher operational costs. So also on pros, I should have put this. Pros, I would say, you know, there's a lot of pros in terms of the usage of that. Like I said, kids need somewhere to play soccer. We need somewhere to have, you know, outdoor concerts and where people can go have, you know, family barbecues. Those types of things work really well with conventional landscaping. So I'm going to add that to the pros category. Okay, so native landscapes, totally different priorities, right? And it's really important to understand the priorities because that is ultimately what kind of builds the base of how we form maintenance practices and how we make decisions on what to do. And so that one's big on like habitat creation and management. So again, considering all the residents, not just humans. Supporting biodiversity, the heritage of the land, lower resource use, and naturalistic design. So again, as you interact with different people, whether that's residents, whether that's management, whether that's other organizations, just remember people's priorities are going to be very different. And regardless of what your specific personal opinions are on something, it's really important to just know the difference between these two and be able to recognize with the person that you're talking to what their priorities are because they're going to be different. And so when you're coming up with a management plan for an area and having to consider all these different viewpoints, just know there's going to be different priorities. And sometimes, I would say most of the time, you can marry the two. It does take a little finesse, but you can usually get there. Okay, material used in native landscapes. Typically, like I said, grasses, sedges, which I'm not familiar with sedges. They're light grasses, but sorry, I should have changed that setting on my computer before I started this, but I did not. Sedges look like grasses, but they're kind of the small, tufty guys that look like tiny little grasses. It's actually a different category of plants called sedges. Forbs, perennials, fruit-bearing shrubs, and multi-level trees. So not just your tall shade trees, also having those understory trees that are going to be hanging out more in the like 10 to 15 foot range are going to be more common in native landscapes. Operations. You're going to be focusing a lot on invasive species removal, such as privet, such as Johnson grass. Burning and mowing schedules. Obviously, that is not happening at all in conventional landscape. Species introduction. So again, if you're like, ooh, we want more biodiversity, that means you have to put in new species. So getting familiar with those species and figuring out how to introduce them into the space. Selective irrigation. Again, conventional is like, we have a schedule. Every month, every year, we switch from this to this. You can program it into a system to be like that. Irrigation in native landscapes is trying to mimic nature, which if you lived in Dallas for any amount of time, is very unpredictable. It just means we'll go months with no rain, and then all of a sudden we get a torrential downpour, and it might not last for 30 minutes, or it could last for a week. We don't really know. So when we're doing irrigation, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but just keep in mind, when we're doing irrigation on native landscape, we are trying to emulate nature. So that does not mean that we're going to have the same amount of irrigation all the time. It's a lot more selective, and it needs a lot less. So you don't have to do it very often, and when you do it, just drench it. It's basically the short form of how to do irrigation for native landscape. And then trimming. With native landscapes, y'all, we trim like once a year, maybe twice a year. Versus a conventional landscape, you're trimming stuff, every 2 weeks, every month? Yeah, it's way more involved on the trimming aspect. And today, in our hands-on section of this, we're actually going to be going over a lot more on the trimming piece because trimming is more involved with native, but you only have to do it once a year. So there's a trade-off there. You only have to do it once a year, but you do have to dedicate usually like a whole day to it. Okay, and then Other pros, we've talked about this, decrease operational costs, the adaptability, hardiness, they can handle our weather, they do that assisted drainage, that thing with the roots that we talked about. Aesthetic value, this is way prettier in my opinion, but you can think whatever you want, I just think this is gorgeous. The absorbing a lot of carbon, so again, for environmental benefit, it's a lot higher on this side. Combating that urban heat island effect, biodiversity, pollinators, clean habitat creation, all of those things. So there's a lot of pros on the native landscape side. Cons, it's a learning curve. There's not a ton of information out there about this. Y'all have probably experienced that. So it's a little bit harder to access information about how to do that, which we also talked about public education, which we brought up earlier. Some people just come out and say, that doesn't look like what I expected it to look like. It's messy. And then species management. That's just, again, that's a learning curve because we have to learn what species are even supposed to be here before we even get to the point of what would they even want. So, two totally different mindsets, and for y'all, you have parks that are filled with both of these spaces. So, getting familiar with both of them is very vital. But I would say the biggest, if you just encapsulate all of it, conventional, we're going with controlling a space. Native, we're switching over to collaborating with it. So think about the beavers. Remember the beavers. That is that's an example of a collaborative relationship with native landscapes and city departments. So how do we care for these landscapes? We're going to start getting into this. First step is what we did earlier, which is identifying that landscape. The second step is going to be that mindset shift where we're understanding different priorities, different values. And going from we're controlling the space to now we're collaborating with the space. Doing a needs assessment for an area. Are there any problems with the area? Is there anything specific that we need to be addressing? And then implementing those best management practices that balance the operational needs with those population needs. So, needs assessment considerations. This is what we're going to go over and focus a little bit more on. And I'm doing a lot of this, I just want to say, because as we get into the specific management practices of how to trim, when to trim, how much to trim, all those questions are all based off of this stuff. So I know it can kind of seem like, why are we talking about birds? But that's all actually going to have a lot to do with the specific things that we're doing when it comes to stuff like trimming. So we're going to talk about natural growth habits of plants. We're talking about migrations. We're going to be talking about birds, butterflies, all that good stuff. Habitat, seed dispersal, and food sources. So, natural growth habits. Very important to know because, again, as we go from control to collaborate, we need to understand how plants grow, especially native plants specifically. 3-year rule. Yeah, my pointer doesn't really work. Okay. Well, the 3-year rule, easy way to remember it is sleep, creep, leap. What that means, when you plant a native plant, it is most likely not going to become some huge, beautiful thing that same year. It is going to sleep. And what that means is actually happening is it's developing its root system. So that crazy long root system that we saw earlier, that's what's happening. You cannot see it. It looks like maybe this plant isn't doing so well. That plant's fine. It's just focusing all that energy it's getting onto developing that root system. The second year is what we call a creep. Is when you start seeing it kind of come out a little bit further. It might not be super heavy on the flowers, but you see it's starting to grow. And then that third year, that's when it just like, that thing grows like crazy. Suddenly it's got all these flowers, it's huge, and you're like, is this even the same plant? That is very common with native plants. So again, especially if we're talking about expectations, communicating these to the public, and knowing ahead of time what to expect with these, it's not instant gratification with native landscapes. It is not, we put this in and now it looks beautiful. Oftentimes it takes a little bit of time, but you reap all those benefits once you have it established. So just bear that in mind for yourselves, but also as you're communicating things to the public. Cycle of plants here. Texas, be crazy all the time. Our weather is crazy. So we are a little bit different than a lot of other parts of the country. In other parts of the world, usually in other parts of the world, they have a growing season that starts in spring and ends in fall, right? We do not, because we live in Texas. In the summer, it is freaking hot. Nothing wants to be growing. We do not want to be outside. They don't want to be outside. So we instead have 2 different growing seasons. we have, and it cycles through. So winter, dormancy, spring, growing, summer, dormancy, fall, growing. And we continue in that cycle, which is very different than a lot of other parts of the country. So when you're learning about these things, sometimes you see growing season and you think, man, that's going to be like what, April to October? And here we cycle through in different sections. And there are ways to kind of start to invent that a little bit with more manicured spaces. Because if you water, then suddenly things will not go dormant in the summertime. Typically things go dormant when they are not getting water, which is just typical in our summers. But if we are applying water to those spaces, we can kind of skip that dormancy period. But again, good things to be aware of. Our goal here is to mimic nature, which is what we talked about earlier. And when we're talking about watering schedules, that's where that really comes into play. Is heavy, infrequent irrigation. That is the name of the game with native landscapes. Because in order to produce those root systems that we talked about, we need that soil to completely dry out, those channels to be created. Remember how we talked about the swelling and the shrinking? So once those channels get created, that creates areas for water to go deep, right? Because it creates those cracks. And so then you get these really heavy watering. You almost, I don't want to say flood it, but you get a really heavy water, and that gets all the way down. It's going to replenish the water from all those roots. It's going to replenish your water table. And that's what we want to see more with native landscaping. You do not need to water that often, but you do need to water heavily. So ultimately, in the long run, it comes out as a lot less water total. But it's, again, really important to be able to have eyes on that landscape and look at it, because that's how you're going to know is it time to water or not. And oftentimes, most native landscapes, I only water them during summer. I don't even water them. I turn it off. I turn off irrigation systems as soon as it starts to cool down in the fall, and then usually it rains so much in the spring. So I typically only do a couple heavy waters in the summer season to keep things from going dormant. Just, because we like things to be pretty, we want things to bloom. In order to keep that same aesthetic, we do apply some water, but this is the name of the game for how to water those native landscapes. Trimming / mowing / burning at appropriate times. Again, burning is for those, 4s and 5 properties. We're not going to be dealing with a lot of that, talking about that today. But we're accomplishing the same thing with that. So all of those things, trimming, mowing, and burning, all accomplish the same thing. So obviously in downtown, we're going to be trimming. There's going to be certain areas, maybe that are like those 3s on the scale. 4s, we're going to be mowing those. But then those 5s, those are getting burned. But ultimately, they're all accomplishing the same purpose. And knowing when to do that at appropriate times, which we'll get into a little bit more, but typically with trimming, we're just going to be looking mostly at, we're going to be looking mostly at doing that in the early spring. Okay, so I know a lot of times we have it in our heads like you trim in the fall. But again, in Texas, when is our growing season? The fall. So we do not want to be trimming stuff in the middle of a growing season. We want to be trimming it after the growing season. And so when we have this cycle, we know what cycles are. We are trimming at the end of the growing season. So sometimes that means that we are trimming at the end of spring. And then other times that means we are trimming at the end of winter, early spring. And we're going to talk about this when we get outside, but I want to talk about a little bit why we don't trim. There's a few reasons. If you trim stuff too early, you trim off all the pretty stuff. That's dumb. That doesn't make any sense. And a lot of times with those grasses, their prettiest season is the fall, right now. They look beautiful right now, so there would be absolutely no reason to trim it right now. And those also provide a lot of habitat for birds, for bugs, for all those little things that we want in our parks. That's how they survive winters. We get it's crazy cold. How do they survive that? Those grasses, that's where they're living, that's how they're staying warm. So if we come in and destroy all of that, that's not exactly supporting all of our residents, right? So we want to wait until the very early spring. When we start seeing that new growth come in, then we can come in and do our trimming. And then fertilizing. That's the other thing. We don't really fertilize that much in native landscaping, at least not in the traditional sense. We're not going and putting out pellets of fertilizer. A the fertilizer that native landscapes need all comes from kind of within itself, right? So when we're talking about those grasses, when those grasses kind of have that dead stuff, that stuff falls to the ground, that replenishes your soil. Composting is another way that I really like to add to native landscapes. You know, just putting on a thin layer of compost is going to do wonders, and it'll last you a whole year, and you do not need to come in and be applying fertilizer. Because fertilizing, actually most native plants do not like it, and sometimes they will die if you fertilize too much. So again, like, decrease your operations. If you don't need to fertilize it, don't. And most native plants do not want it. So even when you plant stuff, you don't really need to be fertilizing anything. As long as you're ensuring that the soil itself is healthy, the plants are fine. Right plant, right place. I think this is a common thing that we all know. Don't put plants where they don't belong. Even with native plants, that still applies. And kind of what we were talking about, if you've got a park that is on the side, and it's a garden that's on the side of a road, next to a really tall building, next to a street, that's going to be really hot. It's going to have a lot of abuse in that spot. So don't put a plant that likes a cooler environment, maybe likes a little bit of shade, maybe likes a little bit more water. That doesn't make sense. But if we look at, okay, native plants, maybe those West Texas plants that can handle those really harsh environments, harsh heat, those are going to be the plants that you want to put in those spaces. And then honoring natural shape and size of each plant. That's another thing we're going to be talking about when we go out to Carpenter today, is instead of trying to control, we're going more to collaborating. So know how big plants get before you put the plant in, because then that's going to make your life way easier. You're not going to have to trim it every couple weeks. If you already know how big the plant gets, then you can stick to that idea of only trimming once a year. And that's what we're aiming for. So if you put the wrong plant in, you're going to be creating more work for yourself down the road, and we're trying to avoid that. Okay, migrations. These are other things that we just do want to be aware of. You don't need to be an expert in them, but you do need to be aware of them. Monarchs, they're coming through, and we want to be supportive of those. Their numbers are starting to decrease. We don't like that, but we still want to have monarch butterflies. And as park managers, we have an opportunity to support that migration. And the best way to do that is planting milkweed. So again, as we're putting these new plants into these areas and focusing on native plants, making sure that the plant choices that we are making include things that are helpful for these for our creatures, right? So for monarchs, it's milkweed, and then also for birds, that's another thing. I don't know if y'all know this, but we have a crap ton of birds that migrate through Dallas. Pretty much all of them from Canada, all funnel straight through the United States, down through North Texas, and then they go down to Central America and South America where they hang out for the winter. So we get billions of birds that come through here. And that is another thing that is really helpful to keep in mind, as we are a stopping point for them. So just making sure that our parks are friendly to that, they can stop through on their way south, and then they can keep on their journey. Knowing when those migration seasons are can be super helpful. I will say the biggest thing with that is going to be lights, landscape lights. If any of your parks have landscape lights, those are going to have the biggest detriment on those birds. So we want to make sure that we're shutting lights off at appropriate times, so that when we have those billions of birds coming through, because lights totally screw them up. A lot of times they die because they get thrown around from the light damage and the light pollution. So we just want to make sure that, again, our operational policies are going in alignment with some of these bird migrations. Okay, so habitat. We want to make sure we're creating habitat in our parks for these residents. So these are parks in Dallas, right? Like this is a big, I'm trying to remember the name of this one. I don't remember, but this was a park in Dallas. Is that, yeah, that is Buckeye. Yes, thank you. So yeah, that's Buckeye Trail. That's pretty much that's right in the Great Trinity Forest, right in the middle here in Dallas. So we do want to make sure that our parks are supplying the things that are needed for all of our residents, right? So as we're putting in new plants, as we're taking care of native plants, we want to make sure we're kind of hitting these different groups. We want to make sure we're providing plants that have berries and seeds for the birds. There's insect populations, the whole circle of life is all kind of coming together in those spaces. And then shelter. That's one of the things we talked about, like management practices. These grasses, one of the reasons we don't trim them is because that's providing shelter for a lot of different species. So that's part of where we're saying, if you consider these birds, if you consider these other animals, that's going to we're going to implement different management practices based on those things. So yeah, we've got streams, range areas, all of that, all those are very present in our parks, right? So in conventional landscaping, we'd be like, ooh, it's brown, doesn't look good, chop it, right? That's a lot of times our mentality with conventional. Whereas in native, that shifts. We're like, ooh, brown, we should keep that. That's going to be like really good bird habitat. So it's that shift, right? And then seed dispersal. So we're also going to see this today in carpenter. The ability for seeds to actually hit the ground and create a new plant, very important. We want that. That saves us money, that saves us time, that saves us effort. We get free plants that way. And that is what we're going for. So especially in a lot of these native landscapes, they are actually designed with the intent that they will fill in with the seeds of these plants. So you might have plants that are spaced out pretty far, but the idea is that they will go to seed, those seeds will fall, they'll create new plants, and you'll have a thicker landscape. Because as y'all know, if there's dirt available, something will grow there. Something will grow there. So you want it to be the stuff that you want. You do not want to spend all that time weeding those areas because that's a nightmare. So when we're talking about mulching practices, if you have a 6-inch layer of mulch, is a seed going to fall and be able to hit any soil? No. So we want to make sure we're mindful of that as we're talking about when to mulch, how much to mulch, what to mulch with. And especially in those landscapes that are more on that 1 to 2 scale, mulch is going to be an aspect of that. But if we've got an area where we're intentionally trying to fill in with certain plants, then we want to make sure we're not putting it down a ton of mulch and preventing the soil contact. Because seeds cannot germinate if they do not hit the soil. So if we're putting a big old layer of mulch, they're not going to hit the soil. And then the other thing is, yeah, they're free plants and you're creating seed banks. That's the other cool thing, which saves the department a crap ton of money. If you've got a bunch of plants that have a ton of seeds on them that you can then utilize at a different park, that's a huge money saver. You don't have to try to work on sourcing all of these different plants from all these different nurseries when you have that seed bank built within your own system. Yeah, food sources, we kind of talked about this. This is another important thing, just making sure that we've got plants that typically we have a lot of berrying plants here. This is an American beautyberry. It is beautiful. We love them. They grow understory in shadier areas here in North Texas, and birds love them. So, is important. Big component of native landscape maintenance is don't poison the food, right? We don't want to poison stuff that other things are then going to eat. So, things like rat traps. We don't want rats. Nobody wants a rat. That's gross. But if we poison a rat and then an owl goes and eats that rat, guess who's now poisoned and dead? The owl. And that happens over and over and over. So we want to make sure that we're talking about food sources, that we're taking care of every element of that food chain. So if you poison something down here, it's going to poison something up here. And so those are things that we want to bear in mind as well. And if you're putting down a ton of pesticides, putting down a ton of herbicides, all the things that eat stuff around there are also getting poisoned. So let nature take care of itself. That is one of the core components of native landscape management, is creating an ecosystem where they all just take care of themselves. The pest control is built into the system, and y'all have less work. So that's ultimately the goal. Okay, fall and winter maintenance, we're going to get into. Let's talk about irrigation for a second. Drip lines. How many of y'all's parks have drip lines? How many of y'all like drip lines? Yeah. Drip lines are a nemesis if you are in an operational role because they get chewed on, they get nicked, they have leaks all the time, and then you can't find the leaks because they're under mulch, which is where they're supposed to be, but then you can't find it until you see something that's dead on the other half of the park. So drip lines are not our favorite, but some of our parks have them, so we do need to still work with some of them. But again, my recommendation, as much as it is in your control, to switch irrigated areas to heads. You can actually save a lot of water that way. I realize it's a little counterintuitive, but you can end up saving a lot more water and a lot more in operations by switching to 6-inch pop-ups than you could on those heads, on the drip lines. But we have drip lines. We've already got a drip line. We need to make sure it is actually under the ground, that it is not sitting on top of the soil. We want to make sure it is actually underneath all the mulch, and that it is actually spaced appropriately. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen bubblers that are on a trunk of a tree. Do we want a bubbler on the trunk of the tree? No, because then what's going to happen? Anybody know? What's going to happen if you put a bubbling head right on the trunk of a tree? It's going to rot. It's going to rot. You're going to rot the trunk of that tree right at the base, and then that thing's going to... So we don't want to do that. We're trying to get the water moved out. So when we're talking about drip lines, especially with trees, remember that the edge of the tree, that is where it needs water. It's not right where the trunk is. The trunk does not need water. The drip line is the same as the canopy line. So again, as we have new trees, I know a lot of your parks are getting new trees, and some of them are irrigated and some of them have that drip irrigation. So just make sure when we're installing the drip that we're installing it far enough away from the trunk of the tree, but it's still getting to that root. And just know that it's going to need to be adjusted. For first year, yeah, it might need to be a little bit closer depending on the size of the tree. But as that tree starts to grow, we move it out, and then eventually it should not need any additional irrigation. But just make sure we're not putting bubblers and drip lines right up on the trunk of the tree. It will rot the trunk. Okay, so drip lines, heads. I'm a big advocate for heads because, again, we like infrequent, heavy irrigation. Load it all up on those heads once, and then turn it off for a month. You know, that's kind of name of the game for native landscapes. And then routine maintenance. Obviously, we need a lot more routine maintenance on drip lines because things nick them all the time. Squirrels chew them, everything chews on them. And so just making sure that we're running through those and making sure that we're checking for leaks, checking to make sure that it's not that the pressure is correct throughout the entire line. We're not getting all the pressure on this end and then it never even makes it down to the other. So yeah, irrigation's a big one, but again, heavy, infrequent. Trimming. When do you trim? What do you trim? How do you trim it? In native landscapes, you almost never use a hedger. I can't think of a single situation where you're going to use a hedger in a native landscape. There's no reason to do it. Most native plants will not like you very much. If you are hedging them for too long, they start to not perform very well. And again, that is something that's more common with conventional, because in conventional we like that controlled boxed look. That boxwoods obviously respond very well to. Hollies can respond really well to that, but if you start doing that to a Texas sage, it's not going to perform super well after a while. It'll survive, but it's not going to be very happy. So when we're talking about trimming, the best way to trim native landscapes is to do it once a year, and you do it by hand. It takes a minute. I'm going to say that. I know it takes a minute. That's annoying, but it's only one day out of the year. And then you don't have to do it for the entire rest of the year. So imagine you do not have to hedge it all year. You completely take that out of your operations, and then you go in and you hand trim once a year with your team. That's going to be more indicative of how we're going to take care of native landscapes that have shrubs. When it comes to grasses, like I said, once a year. We're most likely going to be only trimming grasses and forbs once a year. It's going to probably be the end of February, early March, kind of the beginning of when it starts to get warmer. We're past, our first freeze, starting some new growth, and that is if we're going to trim, that's when we're going to trim. There are some different ways to do that, which we're going to go over this afternoon. Once we're out there, there's a hand combing method that is more involved, but it's oftentimes better for newer landscapes. But if they're more established landscapes, we are going to be trimming those grasses back once a year. How to do it, again, that's kind of what we talked about. Hand combing is a great method for new landscapes. If it's more established, you can use, good old weed whacker and trim, but again, we want to make sure that we are not trimming it all the way down to a nub. It's not going to survive that. You need to make sure you're leaving a healthy amount of space for it, because that's actually insulating that root system. So we're going to leave enough room for those new shoots to come up. Okay, mulch. It's a big one if we're talking about more manicured landscapes, because most of the time we're trained, we mulch once a year, maybe twice a year, depending on the area, depending on if there's washout of the mulch. I'm assuming we use mostly hardwood mulch, yeah? Like aged hardwood mulch here. So I like aged hardwood mulch. I am going to throw in another option of pecan mulch. The Austin Parks Department uses pecan mulch, and I personally think it's a great option. It is in fact just crushed up pecan shells that have been aged, and what it allows for though is when we're talking about those seeds, it tends to be able to actually get inside and make that soil contact in a way that you can't when you've got that layer of hardwood mulch that's just packed in. And just be mindful of where you're mulching. If you're, because I like mulching, mulching's great, but if you're in an area where you're trying to get that soil contact, you don't want to mulch there. You have to be able to recognize if you're wanting this area to fill in with seed, that is not an area that you're going to be able to mulch. And then versus other areas, maybe some tree rings, maybe some other areas that are already established around shrubs, it might be more appropriate to mulch. But the idea with native landscapes, as you'll see in most of these pictures, they're very full, right? There's not a lot of ground space. There's not a lot of dirt space. So the idea is to actually get to a point where you don't need to mulch. Because grasses, those are self-mulching. So all those little areas that are at the bases of grasses, that's going to insulate and provide the same value that mulch does. So we're trying to kind of get to a point where we don't need to mulch. When it's new, you're going to need to, and then as we kind of transition to an older landscape, we shouldn't have to as much. Soil exposure, again, want to make sure we kind of touched on that. But freeze prep, native plants, they're going to do just fine. You don't need to do anything to them. You don't need to cover a native plant, it'll be just fine. The top might die off, the root system will be totally fine. And then seeding, we talked about, no special considerations. So with leaves, that's the only other thing. There's times when it is appropriate to just let the leaves be the mulch. It's a lot more work to go and clean out all of the leaves between a bunch of plants, right? Versus leaving them where they are. Those provide a lot of nutrients into the soil as they break down. And they provide the same value as mulch. So again, if you don't need to mulch and you have a leaf layer, leave it be. Don't make your life more complicated than you need to.
I see a lot of people, they mow in the yard and use the grass on the flower.
Yeah, a lot of times they'll put that grass, because again, as it breaks down, it has a lot of nutrients in it. So, you want that stuff. It basically creates a natural compost. So you go buy a compost, or you can use what's already there. Okay, we're just going to touch on tree maintenance. Sorry.
I was going to say on the mulch, in the urban environment here, I think it's going to be important to, I don't think we can leave the leaves based on expectations of residents or people downtown. So I think we're going to have to find the right balance of what non-mulching nature, how much to take away, or how much of the grass once we cut it to leave on the soil. So just as y'all walk through this afternoon,
Yeah.
I wanted to throw that out there. But there's going to be a different expectation in this urban environment, I think, than a bigger park.
Right. No, and that's true. That's again why it's really important to know where on the scale your landscape lies, because anything downtown is going to be a 1 for the most part. And so in those environments, it's going to probably be a little bit more important to, have that crisper, cleaner appearance. You might want to mulch. But again, for general native landscape maintenance, if you're in a different area and it doesn't need to be super manicured, don't make your life more complicated. Okay, so tree maintenance. I'm just going to go through a few of these because I think a lot of this is stuff y'all know. But these are things that I have run into throughout the city. So we're going to talk about. Okay, picture number 1. We've got stuff around tree trunk. Do we do this? No. It's a no. Because obviously as that tree trunk grows, that thing's not growing with it, and you're going to just totally cut off the circulation system of that tree. But this happens a lot because sometimes it's like, we put this thing up on the tree, and then we forget to take off the infrastructure that held that thing on the tree. So it's really important, and that's part of what we're going over with the assessment guide, is actually going and assessing the trees in your parks and on your properties to make sure that none of this stuff gets left behind. The most common time I see it left behind is with new trees. Right here. So we get new trees and they need to be staked, right? Right at the beginning, they need to be staked. They don't have a root system. They're going to fall over if they're not staked. So, of course, we wrap things around them to stake them. But those are not permanent. They cannot stay there. And I think that is so important to drive home because, hopefully we don't die. Okay, don't die. Oh dear. Sorry. There we go. Because obviously, I'll be honest, I see that a lot. I see if we have a new installation of trees and we don't have the infrastructure put in to be like, okay, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, I need to go back and take these things off of them. So we need to work that into our operational plans. Anytime we're getting new tree installations, if they are staked, we need to make sure that we're putting reminders for crews 3 to 6 months later to go untile them, because that will kill a tree very quickly. We talked about don't put drip irrigation right underneath, right around the trunk of a tree, because that's going to rot. And then again, this was another one that got staked. And again, it needed to be staked. It was important. It needed to be staked. But this was actually a piece of cotton twine that was used that holds moisture into it. That also works. That is going to rot the tree trunk. So do not use cotton. And then we got a bunch of stuff and junk that got piled up in there as well. Okay, another one. This one on the right. I totally understand why we choose to do this. This protects the trunk of the tree from tremors, right? And so as we're going through and doing our weed eating, we want to make sure we don't make the trunk. So we're like, oh, we can use this to protect the trunk of the tree. In certain regards, it's a great idea. In other regards, what loves that environment is fire ants. Fire ants are like fantastic. This corrugated, hot plastic, my favorite. And that is unfortunately what happened at this park. Every single one of the trees had fire ants all piled in there. And again, that is not going to be helpful or healthy for the tree. Mulch. Do I have to go to the mulch volcano? Do we know the mulch volcano? Okay, great. Don't mulch volcano. Yes, and then obviously we've got some growth here happening. That's also a sign that there's rotting inside the tree. You're seeing mushrooms at the base of the tree. There's rotting in the tree. Yeah, so that's again a sign that water is hitting it in some way. So and that is not going to be good, because that is absolutely going to fall over. And then when we're planting trees, I hope we know this, girdling roots. We do not want girdling roots. We do not want roots that are going to be growing circles around the tree, because it will eventually choke the tree. So make sure when we're planting trees, get all those roots out when they're growing in the pot. Make sure your crews know that. Make sure your crews are doing that. Because otherwise we get these girdling roots where it starts growing around the trunk of the tree. But yeah, tree maintenance differs, right? If you're on a 1, which we are in downtown, these are what your trees look like. There's going to be a slightly different maintenance than if you are in the Great Trinity Forest, right? Those are 2 different environments, so 2 different sets of tree maintenance. So just bear that in mind as we're talking about tree maintenance. Okay, and maintenance needs. This is another really important thing I want to focus on is memorize this, have this. This is your gold right now, is the different maintenance that is needed depending on where your landscape is. This is why it's important to identify where on the scale your landscape is. Because you're going to have irrigation and mulching, but that's really all you need for these 1s and 2s. You're not going to be mulching and irrigating a prairie that's 5 acres, right? That's ridiculous. Nobody would do that. Just as ridiculous, you're not going to be burning things that are in downtown Dallas. So just remember where you are on the scale, because that's going to determine which types of maintenance is going to be needed. Trimming, most of the parts you're going to be dealing with are going to need trimming, but that mowing and seeding is going to be more indicative for some of those wilder areas. Invasive species removal, we got to do that everywhere. So different methods to do it, but we got to do that everywhere. All right, I'm going to run through some of these. If you have any other questions, now would be a good time to hit those. Okay, grass is dead or dormant. I get that question a lot. How do I know if this grass is dead, or how do I know if it's just dormant? A lot of times, we're going to go out and do this. If you pull on the grass, remember how deep those root systems are? If you pull on that grass and it does not budge, that grass is perfectly alive. It's probably just dormant. It might be the middle of summer, it might not get gotten water, it might be dormant, so it might be brown. But if you pull on that thing and it does not budge, it is fine. Versus if it's dead, it's going to all that dead stuff is going to come right up. Perennials. A lot of times you're like, man, is it dead? Is it coming back? In the winter it looks awfully dead. But oftentimes they will have that rosette. And if you've worked in this long enough, plants surprise you every single year. You go in, you're like, wow, you're looking real rough. I don't know if you made that, and then, you know, spring hits and suddenly you've got this big, beautiful wildflower there. So just managing those expectations of what things are supposed to look like at different times of the year. We talked about the native shrubs and trimming. We're going to talk more about this as we go out in the field. How do you bring that height down? You do need to shape a shrub. You do need to bring the height down for visibility purposes. How do we do that? We're going to do that this afternoon. We do not need fertilizer for native gardens. They fertilize themselves. It's beautiful. The role of herbicides. There is a role for herbicides. There is a time that it is appropriate to use herbicides. That's going to, again, be more prevalent in those like 3 to 5 gardens when we're having to deal with invasive species management. With Johnson grass, there's an appropriate time to use herbicides. Typically on that like 1 to 2 gardens, though, we don't need to be using any herbicides for those. Maintaining yuccas and agaves, I get a lot of questions about that. Do you trim them? Do you not trim them? What are they supposed to look like? Those are a little tricky, and again, we're going to go over some of that out in the field today. But yes, you can trim them, but you don't need to do very much. Landscape lighting, like I said, make sure those things are on timers. We've got to make sure those things are on really strict timers, especially given the times of year, making sure we're not blasting light when it is not needed, where it is not needed. So we can talk about that a little bit. Yeah, schedules. We're going to go over this more in the spring. We're going to work on more of like what those schedules are actually going to look like. But again, with conventional landscapes, your schedules are pretty much like, okay, this month, this time of the year, these are the things we do, and that's just how it works every single year. With native landscapes, it's a lot more variable. You don't need to do as much landscape maintenance, but you do need to actually go put eyes on it typically to be able to determine when to do what. Yes, there's lots of native plants that grow in the shade, common misconception. So when we talk about shaded areas where it's hard to grow grass, there's native plants for that. And how many, there's 10,000 plus types of native plants. A lot of people ask me that. Nobody knows all of them. Okay, so identifying solutions. This is our last section. Thank you for bearing with me. Common challenges that we go through. There's a lot, but for landscapes, drainage and erosion can be a big one. Plant establishment, grass establishment, litter, you know, there's a lot going on. So there's solutions for a lot of this within native plant landscaping. So, example number 1. Sorry, it's kind of grainy, but this is a hillside on the edge of a park. Having a hard time establishing any grass there. Lots of stuff is eroding. You can see there's a sidewalk here, so all that dirt is falling straight to the sidewalk. The solution here, again, is to put in a little bit of a native prairie, native meadow area. That's going to lock in all that soil. It looks beautiful, does not need to be irrigated. And then you kind of solve your issue with having dirt constantly falling to the sidewalk. Example number 2, our operational capacity. Because y'all are constantly tasked with doing a lot with a little. We all know this. You know, there's only so much time in a day. So if we can decrease mowing areas, that's less time spent at each site, that is less waste to dispose of, less gas for those machines, you've got longer equipment longevity, and less fertilizer. So there's a lot of benefits there on the operational side. You bring your operational needs way down when you've got a native landscape versus areas that you are mowing. Also, there's a lot of opportunities with native landscapes for different types of support. There are tons of groups that love to give money to native landscapes, and they love to have volunteers who come take care of said native landscapes. So, if you have native landscapes, you've got a whole other group behind that who is funding it, has people taking care of it, that's less work for you. So, we like that. That's another great reason to have some of those native landscapes in your park system. Okay, so we're identifying solutions for a lot of these. This is a bioswale, by the way. So it's a little bit more of an extensive one, but this is one way to kind of handle water. It's basically creating a ditch, an intentional ditch, to allow that water to go down. And there's certain plants you can plant with that are going to love that environment. So yeah, when we're talking about creating or solving these problems, it's a lot of it's getting creative. Right? That's a huge component of this, is that each space is going to be a little bit different. So we need to get creative, ask questions, because, I mean, y'all know each other, so ask about what else other people have been doing, because a lot of the problems are the same across the city. And it's also important to ask questions outside of that too, because there's other park departments in the world, right? They've come up with a lot of solutions to a lot of these issues as well. So even other park departments who have similar situations like Austin, like Houston, you know, seeing what methods they're using can also be applied to what we're doing here in Dallas. And then, yeah, just continuing to learn about new plants. You said Asian jasmine. Asian jasmine's great, but you know, there's also another native option that's going to do even better than Asian jasmine and still accomplish that same purpose. So you need less water, but it's also a shade-tolerant ground cover. So learning more of these plants, which we can talk about that one later, but just getting more knowledgeable on knowing what those plants are and what options are available. Okay, got 2 more slides, y'all. Measuring the success. The best way to think about this is surplus value. Okay, if you're putting in the same amount of so much work to these parks, nobody's using them. Nobody's out there. You go there and it's empty every time. Then that's not surplus value. That's not necessarily your fault, but it's just saying, how do we create a space that is actually being used and appreciated with the amount of work that we're putting in? You know, if we're putting in a crap ton of work in this park and it's not being used, then we need to start asking some different questions about how do we create more value in this park. And some of that is going to be you, but some of that is also going to be, you know, we have park board here, we have some different people and saying, hey, people aren't using this park. What if we did X? What if we did Y? What if we did Z? And so y'all are on the front lines. Y'all are the ones seeing these spaces all the time. Y'all are the ones who see if the public is interacting with them. So just being able to make note of those things and then bring it to the attention of people, you know, higher ups to be like, hey, we might need to rethink how this park is being used. And then, yeah, park activation, community building. These are the entire points of having parks, right? They're supposed to build community. So an activated park is a safe park. It's the other thing we just need to remember. Activated park is a safe park. And then biodiversity metrics. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go out. How do we obtain those? How do we know if there's other things appreciated in this park? If you're not familiar with it, there can be a lot of questions there. I'm going to give you some tools so that you can actually analyze that when we're out in the field today. And then, yeah, use of metrics. Just being that might not be totally in y'all's wheelhouse of what is in your job responsibility. But again, y'all are in the front line, so y'all are the ones who see kind of firsthand, like, are people using these parks? What are they using them for? Are the people we intended to use them using them? So those are just things that we can talk about when we're looking at, like, how do we measure success. Yup, we made it. That is it. Thank you. I really appreciate y'all's time.